Tally ho, chaps! The Comics Kid 2099 here to talk about an episode of Green Lantern the Animated Series titled Steam Lantern. If you haven't seen this episode, I encourage you to do so before you proceed any further with this review, because I'll be spoiling it starting now. As we saw in the previous episode, the Anti-Monitor blasted Hal and seemingly killed him. We find out here that he was actually shoved into another universe, a typical steampunk world where a guy named Duke Nigel terrorizes the population, and a hero named Steam Lantern and his lady friend fight against him. Hal helps them and makes it back to his own world, taking their world with him so that they don't die when their sun dies out. So this is a fine episode, I suppose, but I think it would work better in a series of standalone episodes and doesn't work nearly as well in an arc-driven series like what we have here. We're in the middle of a 50-foot alien about to destroy the universe, and we have to pause so that Hal can have some fun steampunk adventures. Even with the first couple of episodes of this chunk of the series being pretty light on the Anti-Monitor, this still feels so incredibly out of place when most of the episodes that we'll get in this half of the season will feel much more connected to the Anti-Monitor storyline. I know, the Anti-Monitor apparently came from this universe, or at least visited this universe to try and eat it or something, so it technically is connected to the main villain, but this feels like it was added as an afterthought so that they could justify doing a fun steampunk thing that really has nothing to do with the rest of the series. We do get a brief reference to Alan Scott, so if you're into that sort of thing, that's fun. I like Alan quite a bit, but really only in the context of the Justice Society. Trying to tie him in with the Green Lantern Corps and everything that comes after the Silver Age introduction of Hal Jordan doesn't really work for me. And if you watch this and get excited that we'll get to see Alan later on, don't hold your breath, because this is the most that we'll ever hear of him. And apparently Hal doesn't even know who he is, so I'm not sure if the plan was that Alan would come from yet another universe, much like how the Silver Age of DC Comics had the multiverse, with Hal living on Earth 1 and Alan living on Earth 2. I guess that would have been neat if they had explored that in a season 2 that we never got, but it might have felt weird when you still have so much mythos to explore and expand upon in this universe. Moving on to the story that we get here, it's not great. When we first get here, Nigel is threatening the citizens with his army of robots, and Catherine and Steam Lantern, called Gil Broom after Silver Age Green Lantern creators John Broom and Gil Kane, which is a nice touch, are fighting against him. We find out pretty quickly that Nigel saved the planet from the Anti-Monitor, and Steam Lantern took the credit for it. So Nigel claims he's only upset that he didn't get credited for what he did. Alright, fine, but one of the first times that we see Nigel, he says nobody is getting out of here alive. Yikes, that seems pretty evil, if I do say so myself. And then we get the, oh, I guess I am a bad guy moment before the big climax. But that loses some of its steam, pun intended, because yeah, you're definitely the bad guy when you threaten to murder someone who stole your thunder. And Catherine and Steam Lantern aren't much better than Nigel. Steam Lantern is pretty bad because he knows why Nigel is turning into a psychopath, and he decides not to spill the beans to maybe save everyone the trouble that they're going through. Sure, later he finally does confess, but why wait? As far as I'm concerned, you're just as culpable as Nigel is in his crime since you allowed this to continue. And Catherine is over here stroking Steam Lantern's ego, calling him the greatest thing since sliced bread. Sure, she doesn't know the truth about Nigel saving the world, but lady, you saw Hal save the day, and you pass that off as, nah, he did a little bit, but my boy Steam did all the heavy lifting. Maybe if she wasn't feeding Steam's ego so much, he would have admitted the truth earlier. And I know I mentioned how this episode doesn't really fit in the overall arc, but how is this episode supposed to be helpful for Hal and friends later in defeating the Anti-Monitor? We find out that Nigel didn't really do much against the Anti-Monitor except push him into another universe. And that's not a viable solution because then you're just dooming others to save yourself, and you lose a son while you're at it. And we're not going to see any of these characters again, so what really was the point? I was probably a little harsh on this one, but this series has had some better episodes. I've enjoyed what we've gotten in the Anti-Monitor Manhunter stuff so far, so I'm holding out hope that the next episode will be better. Until then, be sure to check out other videos I do sometimes, and be sure to check back in whenever I review the next episode of this series. Until then, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.